Most climbers who die in Yosemite don't die on the way up. They die on the way down. After hours of intense focus, physical exhaustion, and the euphoria of reaching the top, the descent becomes routine, a series of rappels, downclimbs, and anchor checks that feel automatic. But automatic is where mistakes happen. Since 1970, more than 60% of Yosemite's climbing deaths have occurred during the descent, when exhaustion meets complacency and the mountain punishes both. On October 23, 2006, at approximately 11:30 a.m. on the Leaning Tower in Yosemite Valley, California, the morning sun illuminated the southwest face. The Leaning Tower rises 1,200 feet above the valley floor, its overhanging granite face jutting out at a dramatic angle. At 800 feet up the wall, two climbers were beginning their descent after completing the west face route. The air was calm, the sky cloudless, perfect conditions for what should have been a routine rappel. Todd Skinner, 48, from Pinedale, Wyoming, was one of the most accomplished and visionary climbers of his generation. He was a pioneer of free climbing, having established some of the hardest routes in North America. As founder of the American Safe Climbing Association, an organization dedicated to replacing dangerous fixed anchors, Todd had dedicated part of his life to making climbing safer. He had climbed on 6 continents and was known for his bold first ascents and infectious enthusiasm for the sport. Todd was meticulous about safety. He had literally founded an organization to make climbing safer. He had survived some of the most dangerous climbs in the world, including multi-day big wall ascents in remote locations. He was climbing with his longtime partner Jim Hewitt, someone he had climbed with for years. But on this day, on a route he had climbed before, during the easiest part of the climb, his own equipment would betray him. Todd and Jim had climbed the west face of the Leaning Tower, a classic Yosemite route rated 5.7, moderate by their standards. The climb had gone smoothly, taking them about 4 hours to reach the top. The plan was to rappel down the route using the fixed anchors, a descent they had both done many times before. They would make a series of rappels, each about 100 to 150 feet, until they reached the ground. Todd's harness was old. He had been using it for years, possibly as long as a decade. Nylon webbing degrades over time, especially when exposed to UV light, sweat, and repeated stress. The belay loop, the small loop of webbing that connects the harness to the rope, is the single point of failure in the entire system. Climbing safety experts recommend replacing harnesses every 3 to 5 years, even if they show no visible signs of wear. Todd, despite his safety advocacy, had not replaced his harness. The decision to continue using an aging harness was not a dramatic error. It was a quiet, invisible risk. Todd had no way of knowing that the internal fibers of the belay loop had degraded to the point of failure. The webbing looked fine on the outside, but inside, the nylon strands were brittle and weak. As he began his rappel, the full weight of his body, plus the dynamic forces of the descent, loaded onto that single loop. At approximately 11:30 a.m., Todd was midway through a rappel, about 500 feet above the ground. He was descending smoothly, the rope sliding through his rappel device with the familiar zip-zip sound. The belay loop had been under tension for several minutes, bearing his full body weight. The degraded nylon fibers were stretching, thinning, beginning to separate. Then, without warning, the loop snapped. Jim Hewitt heard the snap and immediately looked down. He saw Todd falling, tumbling through the air, arms and legs flailing. He screamed Todd's name, but the sound was swallowed by the distance and the wind. Climbers and tourists on the ground heard the impact, a sickening, final sound that echoed off the granite walls. Witnesses at the base of the climb called 911 immediately, reporting a climber had fallen from the Leaning Tower. Yosemite Search and Rescue, YOSAR, was dispatched, along with park rangers and medical personnel. They reached Todd's body within 15 minutes, but there was nothing they could do. He had died on impact, suffering massive trauma from the 500-foot fall. The belay loop had separated cleanly, the nylon fibers pulled apart under tension. Under microscopic examination, the webbing showed extensive UV damage and internal degradation. The outer layer of the webbing had appeared intact, but the core fibers had lost more than 70% of their strength. Todd's harness was estimated to be 8 to 10 years old, far beyond the recommended replacement interval. The severed belay loop became a teaching tool, displayed at climbing safety seminars and used in training materials. Todd's death prompted a wave of awareness about harness replacement and equipment inspection. The American Safe Climbing Association, the organization he founded, issued new guidelines emphasizing the importance of replacing soft goods regularly. On June 2, 2018, at approximately 2 p.m. on the free blast route of El Capitan, two climbers were descending after completing a speed ascent. The free blast is a 2,000-foot route on the lower section of El Capitan, often used as a warm-up or training climb. The afternoon sun had warmed the granite, and the valley was filled with the sounds of summer, tourists, climbers, and the distant roar of Yosemite Falls. Jason Wells, 46, from Boulder, Colorado, was an experienced climber and mountain guide with over 25 years of climbing experience. Tim Klein, 42, from Palmdale, California, was a skilled alpinist and regular Yosemite climber. Both men were accomplished climbers who had summited multiple big walls and were comfortable on technical terrain. They were attempting a fast ascent of the free blast route, a popular objective for climbers looking to improve their speed and efficiency. Jason and Tim had climbed the free blast route in good time, reaching the top in the early afternoon. The plan was to rappel down the route using the fixed anchors, a descent that typically takes 1 to 2 hours. They would make a series of rappels, each about 100 to 150 feet, until they reached the ground. Both climbers were experienced with rappelling and had done this descent multiple times before. Speed climbing inherently reduces safety margins. Climbers move faster, spend less time checking systems, and rely on muscle memory. The rappel anchors on popular routes like the Free Blast are heavily used and can show signs of wear. Park officials regularly inspect and replace anchors, but the sheer volume of traffic means some anchors are always in marginal condition. At one of the rappel stations, approximately 1,000 feet above the ground, the anchor was in worse condition than it appeared. The bolts were old and the rock around them had developed microfractures from years of loading and unloading. Jason clipped into the anchor first and began his rappel, his full body weight loading onto the bolts. Tim was at the anchor above, preparing to follow. The anchor held for Jason's rappel, but the repeated loading had weakened it further. When Tim clipped in and loaded the anchor with his weight, the bolts failed. The sound was sudden and unmistakable. The metallic ping of bolts failing, followed by the scrape of metal on rock. Tim felt the anchor give way, the sudden sickening sensation of falling. He was still clipped to the rope, but the rope was no longer attached to anything. He fell backward, away from the wall, tumbling through the air. Jason heard the crack of the anchor failing and looked up just in time to see Tim falling. He screamed Tim's name, but there was nothing he could do. He was anchored to the wall, unable to move. Climbers on nearby routes heard the sound of the impact and immediately radioed for help. Yosemite Search and Rescue was dispatched immediately, along with a helicopter for aerial reconnaissance. Jason rappelled down as quickly as he could, reaching Tim's body within 20 minutes. Tim was dead, having suffered massive trauma from the fall and multiple impacts against the wall. The bolts had pulled out of the rock cleanly, leaving cone-shaped holes in the granite. Analysis revealed that the rock around the bolts had developed microfractures from repeated loading over many years. The bolts themselves were old, installed decades earlier, and had not been replaced on the regular maintenance schedule. The death of Tim Klein is a brutal reminder that speed climbing compresses time, but also compresses safety margins. The descent is where climbers are most vulnerable, tired, eager to finish, moving on autopilot. An anchor that looks solid can be hiding invisible weaknesses, and the only way to know is to back it up. Tim Klein was an experienced climber who had completed the ascent successfully, moving efficiently and safely. He died not from a climbing mistake, but from an anchor failure during the descent, the part of the climb that should have been routine. Speed is seductive, but in Yosemite, every minute saved is a gamble with equipment that's been used thousands of times before. As they reached a metal anchor station, both climbers reported feeling the unmistakable buzz of electricity, the telltale sign that lightning was about to strike. The metal carabiners and chains began to hum and vibrate with static electricity. The climbers had only seconds to react, but there was nowhere to go. They were suspended 1,500 feet above the valley floor. The lightning bolt struck the anchor directly, following the path of least resistance through the metal gear and into both climbers. The flash was blinding, the thunder immediate and deafening. The bolt's energy superheated the air around the anchor, creating a brief explosion that severed one of the ropes and melted a carabiner into the rock. One climber was killed instantly, the electrical current stopping his heart and causing severe burns where the harness contacted his body. The other climber, partially shielded by the rock face, survived but suffered severe electrical burns, temporary paralysis, and lasting neurological damage. Witnesses on the ground described seeing a blue flash and hearing an explosion, followed by a scream that cut off abruptly. The rescue operation was complicated by the continuing storm, which prevented helicopter evacuation. Yosemite search and rescue personnel had to climb up to the surviving climber, stabilize him on the wall, and then perform a technical evacuation in deteriorating weather conditions. The rescuers themselves were at risk of lightning strikes throughout the operation. This tragedy highlights another aspect of the descent's danger: the vulnerability to changing environmental conditions. Climbers who have successfully navigated the technical challenges of a route can find themselves exposed and helpless when nature unleashes its power. The metal gear that keeps them safe becomes a deadly conductor when lightning appears. From these cases emerge patterns that define the unique dangers of descending. Equipment degradation. Soft goods like harnesses, slings, and ropes degrade over time, often invisibly. UV damage, microscopic abrasions, and chemical exposure weaken fibers from the inside out. Anchor fatigue. Fixed anchors experience cumulative stress from thousands of loadings. Metal fatigue, rock erosion, and weathering create failure points that can suddenly give way. Speed-induced errors. The desire to move quickly during descent leads to simplified safety checks, skipped redundancies, and hurried transitions at anchors. Attention. Fatigue. After the focus required for difficult climbing, the brain relaxes during routine descent, leading to oversight of critical safety steps. Environmental vulnerability. Descent often coincides with afternoon thunderstorms, decreasing light, and changing temperatures, all factors that increase risk. False familiarity. Climbers who have descended a route multiple times develop a dangerous comfort that can blind them to changing conditions or developing hazards. What makes these tragedies particularly haunting is that they claim the lives of experienced, skilled climbers who had successfully navigated far more difficult terrain. Todd Skinner had pioneered routes that most climbers could only dream of attempting. Tim Klein was methodical and experienced, yet both died during what should have been the most routine part of their climbs. The climbing community has responded with evolving safety protocols: redundant anchors, backup systems during rappels, more frequent equipment replacement schedules, and buddy checks before descent. But the mountain will always find the weak link, whether it's in the equipment, the systems, or the human mind. And here's the bigger question. If a mountain like Yosemite can claim even the most experienced climbers in moments of routine descent, what other dangers might we be overlooking in our everyday adventures? Perhaps the lesson extends beyond climbing, a reminder that complacency is the true enemy of safety, whether on a granite wall or in the mundane routines of daily life. For those who continue to climb in Yosemite and elsewhere, these stories serve not as deterrents, but as solemn reminders. The mountain doesn't care about your summit photo, your experience level, or your previous successes. It only respects continuous vigilance and respect, especially when you think the hard part is over.